Hello everyone, welcome back. This is our fourth episode in our mug making tutorial series, and today we're going to go over one of the most important topics when it comes to any sort of wheel throwing, and that is how to properly pull up the walls. Now, if we don't know what that means or we need a little bit of a refresher, here's a quick little video about what that is. Alright, now you may have seen that before or you've attempted it yourself, but now I'm going to go through many different steps and processes and different types of techniques for different people on how to properly pull up that wall. So, for us to begin, I'm going to have a lovely little cylinder right here. Pulling up the wall includes two basic steps. It includes the idea one step is with one hand, the other step is with the other hand. Now, if we remember our clock references before of 12 o'clock in front of us, 6 o'clock closest towards us, 3 o'clock on our right side, our hands were going to be working at 3 o'clock on that right hand side. Our left hand will be on the inside of that 3 o'clock, right hand on the outside. But they only move in this area. They don't need to stray ahead or behind. They're right in here. Now, our inside hand, our left hand, will be naturally a smidge higher than our outside hand. And the reason why is because this mug has a bottom, and that bottom has thickness, which means instead of them starting parallel, our inside hand starts a little bit higher. And that becomes really useful, and I'll show you why. So, that inside hand, what its job is to push out a little dimple. You'll see kind of a curve come out of that side. And what that right hand's going to do is that it's going to reach underneath that dimple and try to bring that dimple vertically up. It's not trying to force it back in and try to remove that dimple. It's just trying to pull it up. Now, how does that actually make it taller? Well, if we remember in the last video, that important but simple idea of as you stretch clay wider, it gets thinner. General idea, the more you increase that circumference, the thinner the walls are going to have to be because you only have so much clay. And so when that inside hand pushes out that dimple, in that little area, it just got thinner and it actually got longer, because if this is a straight line and then you push it out, it now has this entire distance versus just this short little distance, which means if you do that over and over and over again, it's both making this entire area taller and thinner. Now, let's give that a little bit of example. So, two ideas: inside hand pushing out, outside hand grabbing under that dimple and bringing it up. I always try to make sure I have a clean wheel that I'm working with, so I don't want an extra thickness curving out underneath, because I really want that outside hand to be able to get underneath it. Next, you want to make sure hands always have a little bit of water on it. You don't want a little bit of friction at this point. So inside hand curling under, pushing out, outside hand digging in and pulling up. Inside hand is pushing that dimple out. You can see it getting wider and wider. Outside hand is really starting to dig underneath, grabbing that dimple, and we're just going to slowly come up the wall. We're not in any rush. This is a relaxing process, one to just enjoy. Now, as we get closer and closer to the top, I'm going to go slower and slower and slower, and once we reach the top, I'm just going to hang out here real quick, relax a little bit, and then slowly let go. We don't want to rush the top, because a lot of people, what I'll see as they're pulling up the wall, they'll start to freak out as they're getting closer and closer to the top. They'll start to pull harder and harder and harder, and then they'll pull it or yank it in some way and messing up that nice little lip. Now, let's see if we can try that again. We're just gonna make this a little bit straighter. So cleaning up that area at the bottom. A little bit of water. The key here is to go slowly. So inside hand's pushing out that dimple. Outside hand trying to ride underneath it. Slowly, slowly, slowly. We're in no rush. Get to the top, relax a tiny bit, slowly let go. Now, not perfect, but not bad. Let's see if we can get one last one in there. Now, before I do this last one, I have this fancy little animation for y'all that I'd love for you to take a look. Now, the reason why I showed you that animation is that it's really hard for you to see what my inside hand is doing. You can see the outside hand reaching under, but that inside hand goes in and curls out. I use my middle finger on both hands because you can see it's longer. So this middle finger is adding that dimple pressure. My pointer finger is supporting it so it's a lot more stable. And with the outside hand, I use this little shelf that these fingers are making to reach under and support it, bringing it up. So let's see if I can do one more. It's getting a little bit thin, but you know, who doesn't like a challenge? Slow, slow, slow. Getting to that top, and we're nice and relaxed. Not trying to rush anything. Not in a hurry. Just trying to enjoy your time. Getting to the top. Hanging out here for a tiny bit. And let it go slowly. Not bad. I'll take it. Now, the reason why we go so slowly is that if you see all these little tiny lines, each one of that is my finger going all the way around. And so if I rush that, try to pull up faster, you'll start to see larger spaces between these lines, and this wall will start to have a lot more texture. Now, it's thin. Let's see if we can give an example of kind of a rushed pull. Still adding that dimple at the bottom. Now I'm rushing, freaking out. And so you can see those lines happen because I don't let the pressure from my fingertips travel all the way around at a very slow pace, because if you see I traveled a lot slower before, each one of those lines were a lot closer together, making the wall a lot smoother and a lot cleaner, allowing for me to do less later. I don't have to try to clean everything up as much. Now, some people like this aesthetic and like that idea of showing the pulling and showing the pressure, but I don't suggest trying that out first. I don't suggest learning that way first because, one, it's more difficult because now on each one of these bumps out and curves in, we have thick spots and thin spots going all the way up, which means as we're trying to get bigger and bigger, it's going to eventually just want to sink back and kind of accordion itself back together, almost like one of those childhood drinking straws that could extend out but could also just compress its way and just sag all the way back down. And so if you go really slowly, your wall will be a lot more even, a lot more controlled, and a lot smoother. And what I always suggest is if you can do it smoothly and cleanly, then play with texture, play with making it off-centered, play with making it more abstract. But don't start off with abstract because it's going to be a lot harder for you to make it smooth and centered. Always start out clean and simple before you start going wacky with it. All right? Now, I've had many people come up to me saying that they pull up the walls differently. They've either learned it differently or taught it differently, saw another YouTube video that showed them a new technique, something to make it easier or something like that. And basically saying that they do it in a different way. And is that okay? Or are they doing something wrong? Or am I doing something wrong? And my answer to that has always been no. It's not wrong if it works. I'll say that again. It's not wrong if it works. So if everything's working out, you're enjoying it, you can make the shapes and sizes that you want, or with some practice you'll think you'll be able to do it. Absolutely go ahead. I'm just showing you one way, my way, that is my favorite way. I've explored many different techniques, and this is the one that I stuck with. It's the one that I enjoy. It's the one that I think is the easiest, and can create a variety of forms of all scales. And that's the one that I'm teaching you. Now, let's talk about a couple other different ways to pull up the walls and pros and cons of each. So the way that I teach right now within this amount of clay is first working with our fingertips, left hand's on the inside, right hand's on the outside. Left hand, the inside hand's a little bit higher, pushes out, right hand digs underneath, pulls up. Now, some people do it in the method similar to in the last video, how I talked about the claw, where your hands are equal, they squeeze together from both sides and pull up the wall. And they're like, that's the way that I pull up the wall. And great, that's totally fine. The reason why I don't necessarily do it that way is the idea that it's a lot easier to pinch together from both sides with one hand. We're used to that, picking everything up. But with both hands, you have to push in together and keep pushing in to keep that wall going up straight, which can be tough. Versus my way, the inside hand is pushing out and the outside hand is just following along for the ride. They're not trying to keep equal. They're not trying to both push in with some pressure and keep it up. It's just follow the leader. Some people I've seen do it the opposite way, where their outside hand pushes in and their inside hand digs in and follows up that wall. And if it works, go for it. That's actually the first way that I learned, because I thought that's how left-handers do it when the wheel is spinning that way. But what ended up happening is that everything kept turning into a bottle or a bowl. And the reason why is that if my outside hand pushes in and my inside hand digs in and goes underneath, a lot of the times, because the last thing to touch is my inside hand, as that's going up, it's almost getting wider and wider and wider, because this inside hand is the last thing to give it pressure, which just keeps forcing everything out into a bowl. Versus with my method, already tries to counteract that. And so in the last video, we talked about all our volcanoes and the fact that because it's spinning on the wheel, it naturally wants to get wider and wider and wider as it spins faster and faster. And so my inside hand pushes out first, but the last thing to touch it is my outside hand, reinforcing the idea of we're keeping it a little bit in. And through the right amount of pressure, it goes up straight. Now, I've also heard people saying that they like to pull up the wall with a sponge on their outside hand. And they'll push in and they'll try to dig in with their sponge and bring it up. And they say they'll get a lot smoother walls with the sponge. It's not as kind of sharp and aggressive as a fingertip. And if it works, go for it. The reason why I don't use a sponge on the outside hand when I pull up the wall is a couple reasons. One, I like the feeling of direct finger or hand contact with the clay. To me, it feels like I can dig in more, hold on, less likely to slide out. And what I see a lot of people when they're first learning with the sponge is that when they push out, it's a lot harder for them to reach under that dimple with the sponge because it tends to just smooth it over and soften it up as they're trying to pull up. So they can't pull as aggressively, they can't get the height that they're really wanting because the sponge keeps smoothing over the dimple and not really bringing it up as much as they'd like. Also, because of this texture of the sponge, even though it looks like it's making it smoother, it will also take off all the nice kind of lubricating kind of slip, the wet, goopy clay that's on the surface that can be really handy when it comes to our next video on how to clean up the cylinder and get it ready for trimming a foot and adding a handle. It's nice to have that goopiness on the surface because you can smooth it in and really get a nice smooth surface versus when you use a sponge, sometimes when you're pulling up the wall, you're removing all that smooth goop and you're getting a really sandy surface, which takes more work later to smooth it back out. The pro of the sponge, though, is it can hold a little bit of water, which can help lubricate the outside hand as it's pulling up. Sometimes as you practice pulling up the wall, with my method, you'll learn that either your fingertips get a tiny bit dry or the surface of the wall of the clay gets a little bit dry and you get a little bit of static. If you're ever getting that little bit of static, feel free, lightly let go, add a little bit of water, start off where you kept going. Versus with the sponge, the upside is that the water gets to stay in the whole time and you can just keep squeezing it as you're pulling it up. You can get that added little bit of water. So a couple other methods, if you pull up even differently, that's totally fine. Eventually we'll get into a video about how to pull up the walls when you have a lot more clay, where the fingertip method doesn't necessarily work out as well because it's a little bit too gentle. You can't really dig in when it becomes a lot of clay. And then we'll start getting into the idea of knuckle pulling, where instead of this pressure, I switch it out with this bump. So instead of this little stair, we got a now bigger one that's stronger, that digs in to pull up, and this one's a little bit stiffer and can pull more clay. And so if you use this method already, if you already decide you want to knuckle pull for smaller pieces of clay and it works, totally go for it. I feel like I have a lot less small shifts. It's a lot harder to really kind of control the knuckle and be very smooth and gentle with it because it feels like it always wants to pull more than what I want when I'm going for something thin and small. And so that's what I switch from knuckle to fingertip because I can be a lot more gentle. I can be a lot more specific with my movements with the fingertips. They have a lot more sensitivity than with this knuckle. This knuckle is much more blunt force to start getting the pulls going and then finishing it out with the fingertips once we start to get to scale. So that was me talking a lot of different ideas. But when it comes down to it, it's the idea that if it works, then it's not wrong. The idea that, like, there's nothing wrong in ceramics. Now, if you pull up the wall and it cracks everywhere and it doesn't pull up the way you want, then I would suggest trying another technique because that may not be the one that you work with. But give it some time, give it some practice. I may make it look easier than your first couple times on the wheel, but give it a chance, and I'll see you in the next video.